So for the imperfect tense, I think it's good for you to know when to use the verb instead of the preterite past tense, to use the imperfect tense. So a couple of the uses that are a little bit different from our notes, that actions in the past happen repeatedly or habitually, like we put in our notes. So things happen more than once, and used to is part of the translation of the verb. So if we have caminaba, it can mean I walked or I used to walk. Hablaba can mean I talked or I used to talk. So just a different past tense than what we've done with preterite. Also, for preterite, we did a specific period of time. For imperfect, it's an extended period of time. For example, always. If you say something happened always in the past, then it wasn't just for a specific period of time. So that would be imperfect as well. And then estudiaba, same thing. I studied or used to study. Vivía, I lived or used to live. And trabajaba, I worked or used to work. Then if you talk about feelings or emotions, that's kind of falls under description as well. Anytime that you're describing anything or talking about feelings or emotion in the past, you always use the imperfect tense instead of the preterite. And then anytime you're talking about time or referring to somebody's age, which will be the next one, you always use the imperfect as well. So even though time is a specific thing, that if you're telling time of when something happened, I woke up at 5:05 this morning, then that would still be a something that you do in the imperfect tense. It's just one of the reasons that we use that. Okay. Description is a big one for using imperfect. Anything that you're saying that happened in the past that you're describing, you always use imperfect. And then refer to time and age here. Anytime you're referring to somebody's age, when my parents were such and such years old, when I was young, etc., etc., that will always use imperfect as well. For keywords, when you have to compare the preterite and the imperfect later in Spanish 3, then you'll have to know the keywords that we use for preterite tense that signaled last week, more specific, last year, more specific, versus all these other words that are less specific periods of time. So at times, many times, often, frequently are all words that signal that the sentences will be using the imperfect tense. So you don't have to compare preterite and imperfect yet, and you don't have to know the uses for imperfect, but I think it's good for you to get an idea of kind of why we're doing what we're doing. And these words are used often with imperfect tense. So for AR verbs, we have our endings, aba, abas, aba, abamos, and aban. You don't have to worry about the vosotros form. And you also don't have to worry about really remembering something different for the yo form and the el, e, usted, because they're exactly the same. So anything to do with preterite, with imperfect, that will be the case. Notice that with these, only the nosotros form has an accent, very clear accent on that first A of the ending. Then for E or IR verbs, we have our ia, ias, ia, iamos, and ian. Accent on every single one of those I's. And again, that the yo form and the el, e, usted form are exactly the same. Then we only have 3 irregulars to worry about, and that makes life a whole lot easier. And if it's not one of those 3 irregulars, then you're going to treat it like a regular verb and use your AR endings for anything that ends in AR and ER IR endings for anything that ends in ER or IR. For ser and ir, they both have accents only in the nosotros form. And for ver, you have an accent on every single I, because the only thing that's irregular about ver is VE is the stem, so instead of dropping ER, you're just going to drop the R. VE is your stem, and then you add your ER, IR endings, which have accent on every single one of the I's. Notice, again, that the yo form and the el, e, usted form are exactly the same. Anything and everything to do with imperfect will always be the same for those 2 forms. So context clues would always let you know which tense or which subject pronoun you're using there. And if it helps, anything and everything to do with nosotros across the board will always have accents on the nosotros form for imperfect tense. Okay. For telling time, automatically, you're just going to use the imperfect tense. So how you ask time in the imperfect is que hora era. Instead of que hora es for right now, what time was it when something happened? Automatically you use imperfect, and you would use the said, because that was one of our, when we compared said and estad, time and date were one of the said uses. Now, just focusing on the verb, I ran, or I used to run, would be? Good, corría. What about we lived or used to live? Accent on that first I of that ending. Now, they were happy. In this case, for your quiz, you don't have to know meanings yet, so you wouldn't have to decide. But here, since we're using was or were, you would have to decide between said and estad. And being happy, you have to go back to your reasons for using said and estad. Estad is I'm sorry, I of course gave the answer away, didn't mean to. Estad is used for conditions, which being happy is a condition, so estaban. She sang, or used to sing, in the imperfect, would be? Cantaba. Good. And are there any irregular verbs that end in AR for imperfect? Nope. None whatsoever. And what happens if a verb is reflexive? Yeah. You just need your reflexive pronouns, me, te, se, nos, and se in front of your verb. And then you just conjugate the verb normally because there are no irregular reflexive verbs either. What if you have two verbs in a row? Right. So always, always, always conjugate the first one. Don't conjugate the second one. If it's back-to-back in a row, nothing in between. Even a comma counts as something in between there. Yes?
If they're not like back-to-back,
then you conjugate both.
All right.
And then the difference between eat and said is what? What's eat? And what's said? Good. Now, that's a main difference in the meaning, but we should also know that said is used with characteristic, origin, permanence, possession, time, date, relationship, material something's made out of. All the reasons we went over for said. And then for ir, we know that it's the verb to go, often followed, or usually, most of the time, followed by a because you're either going to a place or to do something. So that would give you a clue. Earlier today we were talking about kind of different ways to remember these two. I always do eat and said together, number one, because in the preterite they use the same box. In the imperfect they use two different boxes, but if you remember back to present tense for said, it was the soy, eres, es, somos, son. And so the eres has a similar conjugation in the imperfect, and then you're replacing the E with all the A's here, because if you remember back to when we compared yesterday the present tense endings and the imperfect endings, they all look a lot like the AR present tense endings. So that AS, A, AMOS, AN, for both of them, they all have A's in them in the endings there. Also for eat and said, they only have accents in the nosotros form. And again, of course, anything to do with imperfect is the same for the yo form and the el a usted form. Okay. Do you remember what I means? We wrote it off, a little note on the side of our notes. I took this off the quiz, but it's always good to bring it back. We learned it back in Spanish 1. We just don't use it very often. I is, there is, or there are. And that's present tense. If I wanted to say that in the imperfect, it would be había. And there was a question on your quiz where había was used. And so I just wanted to mention that, but I did take it off the quiz. So in this case, what would había mean? There was or there were. Good. And that is it.